Hi there, I'm Linda and this is Huttons Valley Permaculture. Over the few years since building this garden, I'm finding more and more I'm harvesting from volunteer plants. In today's video, we take a look at these plants and find out what I've done to support these volunteers and how you can do it too. There are a few plants that I've always had trouble growing from seed, particularly celery and leeks for whatever reason. But now I've found this garden has taken care of that problem. First, let's have a look at leeks. Here's a leek plant that did just grow from seed, but you'll notice here there's the flower head starting to develop, and that's the critical part, is to leave these plants finish their growing cycle. So I will let that create a beautiful allium flower head, which then turns into the seed head. From the seed head, I will save some seeds, but what generally happens is that just falls to the ground and starts to grow little seedlings where it's fallen. Some seeds will spread around, but mostly I've found that they've fallen down and start to develop right next to the old plant. Now, hiding in here amongst my volunteer kale plants, you can see an example of where a leek head has fallen down. Just here, that's come from the plant over here and gone through onto my path, and we've got in the middle here a little leek seedling nursery. And the same thing has just happened a little bit further along with all these beautiful little plants coming. Sometimes I even find the little seedlings don't fall from the seed head and they're starting to create new plants. It's pretty amazing, really. Just in this section of the garden that is getting a little bit wild, I did have some seed heads that just grew a lot of seedlings here, and I did transplant some from this space, but I've let a lot just grow here, and as you can see, they just don't have the space to grow into big plants. Where some of the seeds have scattered a little bit further, the plants are a bit more substantial and are certainly harvestable size. In this garden bed, I did transplant some of the leeks from that area that we just had a look at, and they have got a little bit larger. The problem is I didn't put them quite deep enough, so the stems are really quite short. I do try and learn as I go with sort of transplanting things, and with the leeks in this section, I put them down a hole that's sort of about this deep, and I have found that the stems have got a lot longer, so there will be a lot more usable vegetable from these plants. They're still a little bit young yet, but down the track they'll make a really substantial meal. So with a little bit of nurturing of the leek plants, I find that now I've always got a leek that I can harvest. Now to have a look at the celery plants. In this area I did have one big celery that I let go to seed, and there's been so many seeds germinate in this area, some that I've left kind of in place to grow bigger, some that I haven't quite got to for transplanting yet, but you find that you get little areas in your garden that become almost a nursery for certain plants, and that I just use to fill the garden up with lots of these sorts of plants. And letting celery go to seed means you've got another harvest as well. Celery seeds are great, used in the kitchen as a bit of a spice. But when the plants spread their little seedlings around, it's great to be able to transplant them like I've done here in this garden. Or alternately, I'll just let them grow where they landed. Sometimes it's in the path, and sometimes I just move those ones on. With some plants, I actually do let the plant go to seed and then harvest the seed and just scatter it in the general location to sort of help spread the plants around. And that's what's happened in this area here with the Swiss chard. I scattered seeds thinking it was actually beetroot, but it turned out to be Swiss chard. And I've been harvesting from this area as young leaves for salad mixes. And now that the plants are getting bigger, I'll be able to harvest them for more cooked dishes. I do often find beetroot volunteers in certain areas where I've let plants seed and spread those seeds around. I've left these ones sort of in the middle of the path because it's just at the edge of the garden, so it's not in the way too much. But I did move others to the edge of this garden when there's just too many in the way. This is just another little volunteer celery coming up here. Now let's have a look at fennel, which seems to spread around everywhere. But if you look at it through a permaculture lens, that's a win because there's lots of different harvests you can have from this beautiful volunteer plant. Like celery, you can harvest the seeds for a spice in the kitchen, but it's also great when it starts to form the bulbs and you can harvest it. But all of this stem is also great for chop and drop mulching around the veggie garden, or I also use it when I want to build my composts. The young leaves can also be chopped up and added to different dishes to add a bit of an aniseed flavour. Another veggie that I've always found hard to grow from seeds is parsnip. Now this is a nearly finished parsnip plant and most of the seeds have already dropped off and they're starting to spread little seedlings around everywhere. Lots of the parsnip seeds dropped just in this area here, and I did have heaps of seedlings coming up in this pathway, but I've since just mulched over the top of them. But I'm going to be leaving the ones at the side to finish growing and form a beautiful root. I have tried transplanting parsnip before, but it was a fail. They just had multiple roots on them, so that wasn't any good. So I'm just going to let them grow where the seed falls to form that root so I can get a harvestable crop. And while most cabbages I grow from seed and then transplant out into the garden, I do find I have some success with volunteers there too. This beauty I think is a Savoy cabbage, which is a volunteer in this area. When it has developed its head, I will be harvesting it because I do want to develop this overgrown area into a couple more garden beds. In the Brassica family, my most prolific volunteer so far has been the Russian kale, which seems to pop up in a number of spots in the garden. It's most welcome because I love to stir fry that up with the other varieties of kale that I grow, and even some of the broccoli leaves are great to stir fry up with it as well. Now this area of garden is my former sweet potato bed, which I'll be planting out with onions. And when I was having a closer look at it, I've discovered some chamomile seedlings coming up. There's lots of these little plants dotted everywhere, and while I don't want them growing here, I have potted up those volunteers to grow on a bit before planting back into an area of the garden where I want the chamomile. Some areas of my garden seem to get really out of control, but it's really just plants finishing their growing cycle and starting to form the seed heads. And in this area here is an example of the rocket that is currently going to flower on some plants, but then we've got young plants coming up in the path here that I can harvest from. And likewise with radish seeds and radish plants, if you let them seed, they will drop their seeds and grow new plants. So right here I've got purple and red radishes growing that I didn't plant, but the plants took care of that themselves. Here's one of my daikon radish plants starting to flower, and I'll be letting that finish the life cycle and go to seed because I love to have a few daikon radishes growing around the place. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you might recall the beautiful chicory flowers that were growing here. Purple flowers that the bees absolutely adored, and that was two plants in the chicory family, a curly leaf endive and a radicchio. Now the radicchio seeds have grown beautiful plants of two varieties. There's a green one and then a really beautiful deep red one. And the curly leaf endive has spread itself around in abundance, and I'm grabbing a lot of these along with this perennial sorrel plant that again volunteers really well in the garden, and I'm making lots of my winter salads with all of these beautiful leaves. It seems like I have thousands of these sorrel plants in the garden, which just came from one plant that I let go to seed here. Now it is a perennial plant and will keep growing. And I was a bit concerned about having all those sorrel plants around the garden, but now I just chop it all down, chuck it in a salad, or use it as mulch. Again, pop it in the compost. There's lots of things you can do with all this beautiful organic material. Asian greens are another plant that I like to volunteer in the garden. Here is a pak choi that is flowering, and I'm just going to let that go to seed to hopefully spread the plants around. Now herbs are another great thing that you can let volunteer in your garden. Here's a coriander, or cilantro as people often call it, and that produces masses of seeds which can naturalise in your garden as well, along with herbs such as your parsleys and chervil I've got growing in my kitchen garden in abundance. Just here are a few carrot plants which volunteered in the garden. This is the first year I've had volunteer carrots, and I think it's because I left a number of carrots to go to seed. I think there needs to be a bit of cross-pollination between different plants to get successful seeds coming from those plants. Now, not all plants will grow true to type, but so far I've been happy with the volunteers that have been happening in my garden. And I suppose the important thing is just learning to eat what does volunteer. If you want easy gardening, it's about going with the flow and eating what's available in your garden at certain times of year. Now, I do like to plant annuals like the chilies and eggplants and tomatoes, which might need a bit more nurturing. But for all these sorts of greens and root crops that will readily volunteer, I'm supporting them so they can support me. From time to time, I do find I run out of some of my volunteers. Here's a lettuce that's starting to flower and seed, and I don't have a lot of lettuce around at the moment, so I'm certainly going to let that go. But occasionally I might have to scatter a few more seeds into different areas just to restart the process. Now, I can only really talk about what's happening here in my cool temperate climate, which really doesn't freeze. So if you're in a colder climate, you might just have to experiment to see what seeds and what will come back in warmer times in spring. What I love about this style of gardening is you don't have to think about timing. The seeds drop to the soil, and when the conditions are right, they will start to grow. Another thing I love about this growing system is that it supports ecosystems. By increasing food supplies and habitat, you get an increase in insects and birds, which actually helps support all your plants to grow a lot healthier. If you're happy to eat what grows in your garden, then this style of veggie gardening is a win. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Thanks so much for watching, and bye for now.